Welcome to this Getting Started with SharePoint Framework tutorial series, and this is tutorial 1, Build Your First SharePoint Client-Side WebPart, aka HelloWorld Part 1. And this is the September 2018 edition, so we keep on evolving both the written guidance and also those videos whenever we are releasing a new version of SharePoint Framework. In this case, tutorial 1 consists from creating our first solution and testing that solution in a local workbench. So let's actually jump right into it. So in my case, I'm going to use a commander. This is my personal preference for using a command line tooling. You could just as well use PowerShell or just a classic command line tool from Windows, or if you're using a Linux or Apple or iOS, you can use whatever is matching to your machine. Please remember that you have to have followed the getting started or setting up your development environment guidance before you can actually start implementing or applying the steps in this tutorial. The first thing first is to define what is the location where we want to actually create our folders for our solution. So in my case, I'm going to actually create a tutorials folder in my D root. So I'm going to actually then know that this is where the tutorial code is located. And then I'm going to do a hello world WebPart folder. And I'm going to actually go to that HelloWorld WebPart folder. And there we go. Now we're in the right location where we start then creating our solution. The first things first, I need to execute the Yeoman template of SharePoint Framework. So let's actually do Yo Microsoft SharePoint. And that's going to start at the Yeoman template for SharePoint Framework solution. So it starts then asking questions related on what kind of solution we are creating and what kind of settings we want that solution to have. In this case, this was the tutorial 1, so we can absolutely use the default settings and default setting for the solution name. So we're going to use Hello WebPart as the solution. The next question is around what is the baseline of the solution, what we actually kind of create. So this means that if I want this solution to actually work with SharePoint Framework 2016, I can choose the lower selection. Pretty soon there's a SharePoint 2019 selection here as well, but in my case I'm going to use the latest version what is available. Now the difference here is that the SharePoint 2016 as an example is supporting only SharePoint Framework 1.1, and that means if I scaffold the solution using this option, we can actually use an older version of the packages, and not all of the let's say capabilities and features are available within the older versions. If I choose SharePoint Online only, that's always the latest SharePoint Framework solution, but that solution package only works within a SharePoint Online. Now the next question is around where we can actually place the code. So it's going to be only in this folder, and let's actually use that current folder as the location. The next question is also really interesting, a really detailed question, which we need to understand in a bigger scheme of SharePoint Framework. So there's two different options to actually get your web parts available within the tenant. And this is a matter of a design decision. So you might have a web part which you want to have available across all of the sites within your tenant. And in that case, we would answer yes to this question. And what it means is that whenever the solution is installed to the app catalog, the web part is available for end users from the web part picker immediately. And that's a really important distinction between the answering here no. And that means that you need to actually explicitly install the solution to site before the web part is being visible for end users on particular site. So this is a capability called tenant scope deployment. And in our case, we're going to say no. So we want to explicitly install the solution to a site before it's available for end users to choose from. And then the question is on what kind of client-side component type we want to create. Right now there's a web part and extension type. In future there will be multiple other types here as well, so we're going to use a web part in this particular case. And then we're able to choose use the hello world, the default setting or default name, and also the description. These are the values which will be visible in the web part picker when people are editing the page, and you can absolutely modify these things after the scaffolding has been completed, so they will be available in the WebPart manifest file for you to maintain. So we're going to use the default values for now, but we can modify those settings afterwards. And then a really interesting question: which framework would you like to use? So there's 3 options by default in the Yeoman template scaffolding. There's a no JavaScript framework, there's a React, and a Knockout. This does not, however, mean that none of the other JavaScript frameworks would not be supported. This only means that will you get the default solution structure, which has by default already associations to the React and Knockout or not. You can just as well, SharePoint framework supports Angular, Vue, Amber, whatever, Handlebar, so you can use any framework what you want. The question here only is related on what is the default structure whenever your solution structure is getting provisioned. By default in Microsoft, in first party implementation, we use React. But now if you want to use Vue or Angular or whatever, you're going to use select no JavaScript framework, and then we're going to associate those files and those structures inside of the solution after the scaffolding has been completed. So any JavaScript framework absolutely supported with SharePoint framework. And in this case, we're going to use no JavaScript framework, and that's going to start the scaffolding project. So first of all, it's going to create or copy the files based on the settings which you provided on the questions and updating the metadata in those settings. And the next step is that it's going to actually start pulling all of the dependent files and packages from the node gallery, almost like a NuGet gallery if you come from a Windows background. So getting dependent assemblies, dependent functionalities available. Now, getting this scaffolding completed can take a few minutes. It slightly depends again on a machine and the timelines and everything else. So we're going to speed up a video whenever the solution is completed. And there we go. Now is the solution structure has been completed, the solution installation of the scaffolding has been completed, and we're ready to go and start testing our solution for the first time. Now, before you can do that, there's one small step which you need to remember to do once per machine. So you can do this multiple times in the machine, it doesn't really matter, but you need to do it at least once. So we need to install a dev certificate to the machine so we're able to serve this content from a local host using SSL. And the reason for that one is that in many cases you want to actually use you need to use the SSL to be able to download or reference the assets and JavaScript files from your local host dynamically from SharePoint Online. So later on in the tutorials, we're going to actually download or reference our JavaScript files automatically from the local host. And to be able to do so, you need to have the local host serving the files using SSL, because otherwise there's a SSL, HTTP, HTTPS reference conflict in a browser, and that's not going to actually work. And to be able to do this, there's a really simple gulp command. So let's actually clear some space here, and let's do gulp trust dev cert. And this is the command which is going to then make sure that the dev certificate has been installed to this machine. You need to be an administrator to make this happen. Slightly again, depending on your setup on your machine, it's going to prompt certificate installation. In my case, it didn't, because the cert has been already installed to this machine. But this running the command will make sure that you have the local host, and the local host can serve the content using SSL. That's really important for the rest of the tutorials. Now, the next steps is then to test this WebPart in the local workbench. So after initial scaffolding, we're able to then run gulp serve. And this is going to actually start the local workbench. And local workbench is something which gives you the capability of testing your WebPart locally within your local host. So you're able to test how the WebPart actually works, how it behaves, without even having connected to the internet. So right now, this started our local workbench. We can see that it's actually coming from a local host 34321. And it's kind of mimicking the SharePoint Online experience. There's some layouts, selection available here. You're able to then also see the WebPart picker, and there is our HelloWorld WebPart, which has been now scaffolded based on the default settings which we provided. So now if I click this one, we can actually see the web part available. This is the default scaffold result from the solution. And then I'm able to modify the properties of this web part. So by default, we provide the group name description field and a value, which is hello world. But I can modify here and add, for example, SharePoint framework is cool. And you can see that that text is dynamically updated automatically to the web part UI. So whatever I modify here is actually visible in the web part as well. And that's because we have this fluent way of doing modifications automatically and redraw the web part immediately when we write something or we do modifications on a web part property pane. This is actually a optional thing. By default, it does this. If you want it not to do that, you're able to control that in the code as well. So let's add there SharePoint framework is cool, because SharePoint framework is really cool. Now, the next thing probably what you want to check is how your code actually look like. So let's move back on the command line, and we can see that the command line is now serving the local host. So if I scroll slightly up, we can actually see where we started the local server, and all of this was automatically started. Live reload is started, which means that if we do a modifications on a code, it's going to detect those changes and it's going to refresh the UI automatically. But in my case, or in this case, we will actually want to have a look on high level, the structure which got created. So let me actually do a Control C. So we're going to terminate the batch process so the local host isn't running. And then we're going to do code and dot, and that's going to then start the Visual Studio Code in that solution or in that folder. So we can actually see the default structure which is getting rendered or created whenever we run the Yeoman scaffolding for SharePoint framework. Now, a few things to notice here. So there's quite a few folders available by default. We can see that package.json is the one which is referencing the right versions, for example. So this is one way of checking which version of SharePoint framework I'm currently using. So we can see that we're using 1.6 version in this case, because this is from the September 2018. Sorry. Other things to notice here is that, for example, YoRC is defining which version was actually used to generate this structure, which is interesting information if you need to troubleshoot something. Config folder has plenty of configuration files, for example, package solution, which defines how kind of solution file is getting packaged whenever we actually are ready to go for deployment of the solution inside the actual SharePoint. But that's another tutorial, so I'm not going to use that one or do that one yet. What we want to do, however, is that we want to extend the source folder, and we want to extend the web parts, and we actually want to open the HelloWorld WebPart TS file here. Maybe one thing to notice here, so in my case, in my environment, I'm using Visual Studio Code, and I'm using these icons, and this is an optional thing. Again, depending on what kind of setup you have, you might have nice icons, or you might have slightly different looking icons in your development machine. Now, in here, in the WebPart code, so let's quickly have a look on this. So here, this is the WebPart properties interface. So this is basically defining what kind of properties are available for the WebPart with connect together with the WebPart manifest. So if I open up the WebPart manifest, this is the one which is actually defining what is the WebPart name, what's the title of the WebPart, what is the description of a WebPart, and also what are the properties which we expose for the WebPart. And the same properties are then matched within here in this interface. The render method, now we're inside of this WebPart, which is inherited from Praise client-side WebPart. The render method is the one which is responsible for outputting whatever HTML on the page. And in this case, you saw from the example that whenever we updated the description property, it was output inside of the contact, and there we go. There's artist.properties and description. That's the one which is getting output as part of the HTML. Now, let's actually slightly start modifying this forward. So we want to add a few more things and modify and test how things actually work in the property pane. So we're going to add few more properties for this WebPart and a few more editors. So I'm going to actually slightly modify the WebPart base selection here. So I'm going to actually paste in a few additional fields. There's a property pane checkbox, property pane drop-down, and property pane toggle. So we're going to test some of these properties. And then we're going to modify this property pane, so the definition. So let's add here a few more properties available. So we can add test, which is a string, test, which is a boolean, test1, which is a boolean, test2, which is a string, and test3, which is a boolean. So we're going to test a few different setups in the property pane. Now, then what we want to do is that we want to modify the property pane render or the property pane configuration. And this basically means the configuration or the instruction or the code which will be used whenever somebody modifies the WebPart. And let's scroll down, and that's in here. So get property pane configuration. So by default, the default scaffolding gives you the editor only for the description field. So right now we, however, added few additional properties for the WebPart, and we want to test out how these property pane controls actually behave and how they're visible in the UI. So let's actually scroll down here. Let's actually replace the whole method. So I'm going to get rid of that one and going to paste in the example code from the tutorial. And let's have a look on what we're doing here. So first of all, we have a header. We take the header from those strings, and that string file is actually coming in here as well. So from the localization, and there's my strings. We have a basic group name, and then inside of that group, first we have a description. Then we have the test field, which is set to be a multiple line text field. So we're rendering a property pane text field with the multi-line equals true. The next entry here is a property pane checkbox. This is for test 1. And that's basically a Boolean value. So we're going to have a checkbox rendering for that Boolean value. Then there's the property pane dropdown, which is for test number 2. So this one, test number 2, value of this one, property, and was a string. But how we want to expose that selection is using a dropdown, and we're going to give few different options. So based on a selection of the end user, it's going to then have the key value stored inside of the test2 property. And the last one was test3, and we're going to use the property pane toggle control to actually render that one out. Now, let's actually modify, or let's get one more thing available. So let's actually get this one here, and let's also, now that we have here the interface and we have the additional properties available, we can actually see that we have a nice intelligence available for adding those properties then inside of our render method. So in this case, like based on our guidance, let's add a property output rendering of the test property for the page. Now, we added few properties in the interface, but we need to also make sure, we need to tell SharePoint that these properties actually exist using the manifest file. So let's actually, in here in manifest file, you can actually see that there's only description definition for now available. So we want to add few more properties available here and define a default value for those properties. So here we go. So the default value for test will be multi-line text field. Default value for test 1 will be true. Test 2 will be true. Test 3 will be true as well. So let's save settings and changes. Let's save changes. And now we're able to basically start testing the functionality again. Now, because we run and because we paused the command line, nothing is running for the time being. So we need to actually start here again, call observe, and that's going to restart the local workbench in the default process session, which we had already open. And now if we go here and we modify, or we add the WebPart, HelloWorld WebPart available, we can see the default value for the additional string, which is multi-line text field. And now if we go and modify the WebPart settings, we can actually see that we have a much more complex rendering of the WebPart properties. We have the checkbox available, we have the multi-line text field available, and that's actually getting updated on the UI as well, because we added that entry in the render field. We have a drop down, the default value was 2, and we're able to select the different drop down values. And then there's a toggle value as well. Cool. So that works. So that's now available, and we're able to test that things are working properly. Now, if we want to have access and if we want to test the same functionality in the context of SharePoint, we can actually easily do that by going to your tenant, whatever tenant you actually want to use. And then we kind of ask or request the online workbench. An online workbench is located in a URL underneath every single site. If you go _layouts 15 workbench.aspx, and that's where the online workbench actually exists. So if I'm now going to do an enter, it's going to actually load the online workbench, which we can see is looking exactly it's almost looking like the local workbench, but it has all of the other web parts available as well, because these are the web parts where in the context of SharePoint, these are the web parts which are available in this site by default as well. What's so cool here is that your HelloWorld web part is available in this web part picker as well. And this is because, let me flip back on the console, our local host is getting served. Our local host is getting served using SSL because we run that dev certificate available for local host. The SharePoint Online workbench connects and calls back to online local host in your machine and requests if there's any manifest available to be shown. And now if I select the workbench from here, we can actually see that we have the new web part available. We can see that the properties are available here, and we're able to modify those settings, and in the same way as in local workbench, online workbench is acting based on the selection or the values of your properties, so you can easily modify, and you can see that it's looking precisely the same as your local workbench, except now we are inside of your own tenant in _layouts and workbench folder, or the URL. So we are in the context of SharePoint Online. And this is where you basically then do development where you are context based. So if a web part, for example, wants to access a list within a web part, or wants to access end user settings or properties of the user who's using SharePoint Online, we need to do that in the context of SharePoint Online. And that's why the online workbench exists. If you're only using the web part for rendering non-contextual information, for example, if you're connecting to third-party APIs, or you're just creating the design of a web part, you're able to use then the local workbench for the basic setup. And in the following tutorial, we're even using mocking, so we're kind of mimicking the access of the SharePoint Online in a local workbench without the requirement of getting to the local workbench. But the local workbench is there, so you can do development without the context of SharePoint Online. In SharePoint Online, you have an online workbench, which gives you the context of SharePoint Online, and then you're able to see all of the other web parts and settings and everything else available. Good, that's all we're going to do in this tutorial. So let's move into in the next tutorial. We're going to then actually start accessing the information in SharePoint Online site and adding additional code to this web part. But thank you for watching of this one, and hopefully you'll follow up on tutorial 2.